Okay, we're going to talk for a little bit about a topic we're calling the 7 stages of embrace, a journey from resistance to flow. We start by introducing this through a concept that we call the spectrum of embrace. And on one end of the spectrum of embrace is we don't like what's happening and we're resisting it, and we're busy trying not to be with what is when we don't like it. And on the other end of the spectrum, we are absolutely beyond surrendered to what is. No particle of our being is interested in changing what is in the moment. We might want to change our reality by making new choices for the future. But
But there's not a resistance to feeling
exactly,
what's there for us.
exactly. Let's see. This whole thing starts when we are in gestation. And when we're in gestation, our needs are cared for. Things are usually pretty nice in there. And we're being taken care of. Everything feels warm and cozy. But that whole situation doesn't last terribly long. And then we have to be born. And as soon as we're born, there's this enormous shift from being constantly protected and feeling like everything is done for us, really, to feeling scared, overwhelmed, exposed, and our needs are not perfectly cared for. Even if our needs are very well cared for, they're not as perfectly cared for. And we all have a different sort of a spectrum. Some of us had our needs less cared for and others more. But no matter how much or little in that spectrum, we started having the experience of pain, fear, and disappointment.
Yeah, and from very, very early on, that assumption that something is wrong that we felt as very little babies, and that we carry this assumption that something is wrong with us, with others, with life, and we deal with that throughout our lifetime in various ways. There's generally this feeling that we get in our body, and we link it up to our thought that something's wrong. When I feel this, something is wrong. And we all feel it differently. But I think most of us do feel this.
And I think it's understandable that we conclude something is wrong because um, rebirth felt much nicer for most of us. And so coming out into the world, by contrast, feels way less comfortable than that.
Because our unique needs aren't being met. So we do get that feeling something is wrong and a lack of safety.
Yeah. Even if our parents do their level best, and they all do their level best usually, their capacity to understand the huge difference of who we were relative to they were is hard to get completely past.
Yeah.
The parents will never fully get us. And of course, we don't really get them at all when we're that young. So this brings us up to um, a description of stage 1 out of 7, which we're talking about in this spectrum of embrace. The first one is we could call it rejecting and resistance. So early in life, we often reject what feels threatening through denial, which includes suppressing emotions to survive. We're doing this to survive. And um, the suppression of our emotions creates disconnection between us and our own emotions and between us and other people. We also resist through distraction, avoiding discomfort by running to external activities and phenomenon, spending lots of time on YouTube or, whatever,
Well, yeah, food,
for
drugs,
drugs, rock and roll, whatever,
being online.
right? All of these various forms of distraction um, keep us in a form of running that we don't really know is happening when we're really young because we've got the energy for it. And so, but when we get older, we start noticing that we're starting to get exhausted, that there is a huge amount of energy that gets expended through trying to deny the truth of how things are in this particular moment. It does take tremendous energy to do that. There's also the whole attempt at fixing. These are like the three major approaches to dealing with discomfort. Fixing includes trying to improve ourselves, thinking that good spiritual people are people who are constantly fixing themselves and are always becoming better.
And because there's a denial of what we actually feel based on what we've been taught we should be feeling, based on all
Right.
kinds of spirituality, based on
Right.
what the government says, based on what our parents tell us, what the schools tell us. So there's always that rejection of what we feel compared to how we think we should be feeling and showing up.
And a lot of that whole fixing thing is really about unconscious attempts at conforming so we fit in, so we feel like we belong.
Yeah, and safe.
And safe, right? This kind of, it'll keep coming back to ways in which we do and don't feel safe, and the degrees to which we don't feel safe uh, gives us cause to try to defend ourselves from feeling exposed and unsafe.
Yeah.
All of these strategies help us survive our childhood, but they require us to give up parts of ourselves while we're growing up in order to get whatever love we can and connection we can with our parents. So for instance, a lot of people just give up their authentic feelings because if they were to express their authentic feelings, they get rejected one way or another from the parents. And so the result is we're trying to become like the person we think they want us to be in order to have the least hassles and the most support.
Yeah, it's like Gabor Mate said, all of us, we have a choice between authenticity or safety and belonging. And we almost always routinely choose safety and belonging and give up our authenticity in order to survive. So we all deal with that.
Which is another way of saying that we actually need to survive. We have to attend to our survival first. Once we have attended sufficiently to our survival, where we have enough wellness and money to pay the bills and anything else we need to live, then we can afford to let ourselves starting to feel a little more uncomfortable. So there's nothing wrong with this impulse to care for ourselves and to get money and to do all those, set up a house and have some cats and a partner and all those things. We need whatever forms of safety and security we need personally so that we can feel, so we can risk feeling things that previously have felt threatening.
So that we can connect more deeply with who we are.
Yeah. And live our lives without running from trying to fix or deny what we're feeling. So it gets us very present when we're working that way. So even though the name of this step one or this stage one thing we're describing here includes the word resistance, resistance gets a bad rap in spiritual circles, as if resistance is necessarily bad. But basically, we're just saying resistance is okay. It indicates that we're not feeling very safe.
Talking about safety, that like the reason it's so hard to be in our bodies is because we don't feel safe. So we live in our heads thinking it's way safer there. And we keep dealing with this as we get older.
Living in our heads is sort of the ultimate avoidance of discomfort. Because our minds are able to create a sort of a whole movie and inner environment for us according to our own desires. And so it's much more pleasant being in the various kinds of fantasy and involvements we have with our mind than it can be to just kind of be here in a raw way and feel whatever's going on. And because our mind also can just keep telling us, oh, everything's going great. Our mind basically is sort of like plastering smiley face stickers on the inside of our jail cell and trying to
Well,
convince us.
for the type sevens,
The
maybe.
type sevens, yeah,
Not
that's
for a
right.
lot of the other types.
That's right. But basically, it takes a while before we start noticing that this is all part of a distraction. This is all part of an inner distraction. So once we start getting that, we start entering step 2 or stage 2, which we're calling tolerating. The first shift toward acceptance begins with realizing that the patterns of avoidance limit us in ways that are not good for us. It limits our ability to love ourselves and others, it limits our wellness, and it limits our fulfillment because all of these patterns are basically keeping us distracted and out of our own bodies. And it's just bad for everything to do with our lives.
So we start to develop a behavior that just endures. We endure what is happening, often bracing ourselves to try to control the impact we feel is coming at us. So we develop a stance.
Right. And the stance of endurance, by the way, often includes a very deeply subconscious assumption that we can always off ourselves if things get really bad. Because we're still like assuming this is not going in a good direction. I'm not sure this is working out. So if you notice yourself enduring, in the context of waking up, okay, that's actually a good thing because now you can start appreciating what it feels like in your body to be in that stance. And basically, it feels kind of uptight. It's not comfortable.
But we think it's safe. We feel safer in that familiar
Right.
Stance.
Right. We were just conditioned into the stance. We were sort of,
Yeah.
it's almost like we were twisted into a shape by the environment we had to endure growing up. And I know some of you might be thinking, endure? I had a great childhood. But whatever the heck it was, we still had to twist ourselves to some shape that wasn't entirely authentically who we are in order to be in it and get what we needed.
Yeah.
So the next stage we're calling permitting includes moving toward deeper acceptance by allowing present moment experiences without resistance. This is the practice of green lighting and the practice of allowing things to be as they are consciously. It's like you start consciously noticing, I want to be more relaxed with what is. And so you start noticing the ways in which maybe you're not so relaxed with what is. And you start practicing, okay, I'm going to check in. I'm going to feel what's here. I'm going to feel whatever feelings are present. And I'm just going to allow that. Just going to permit that. So it's the beginning of moving out of the deeply resistant and rejecting and fixing kind of stances.
And it's a shift out of the mental commentary, the narrative that keeps going into direct feeling in our bodies.
Right. It's the beginning of that.
Yeah.
It's the beginning of that. We then call step 4 welcoming, which goes a little bit beyond permitting. Because you can see that, we're starting with rejection and resistance. The next one is tolerating. The next one is permitting. And now we're up to welcoming, which is really different than permitting. Because I think just from feeling the word permitting, you can still tell that there's some rejecting going on if you have to permit it. But when you get to welcoming, there's an even deeper relaxation into the truth of what is, a fundamental recognition that whatever's going on in here, we're better off being here than somewhere else. Like there's no place like home, basically. You start realizing there's no place like home. And so you start spending more time there.
It takes a really big shift to see that it's better to feel whatever's actually happening than to be in some other uh, fantasy place.
Mhm.
Takes a lot. It takes great courage, um, and a depth of wanting to be
Mhm.
here more.
This phase, it describes the period just prior to what's being called in Trillium whole being, initial whole being realization, what used to be called second birth, and what I call embodied unity consciousness. Just prior to that stage, we start realizing, because we've become awake in consciousness by this point, we get to this place where we realize that the presence that's always here is who we are, and it's just part of what is. But even that wasn't enough to fulfill our urge for wholeness, because that's just one part of who we are. So then we start feeling the rub of infinite and finite, of personal and transpersonal. We start feeling, in a way, what we could call a feeling of crucifixion, which I want to actually talk about more in the next month talk. But it's a crucifixion in which the infinite freedom of spirit is needing to endure the deep and often painful limits of humanity.
And feelings of stuckness and not moving and darkness and whatever that is for each of
But
us.
around this time, there's also the recognition of the infinite spaciousness and freedom of consciousness. And there's this like, how do I resolve this weird paradox? Some people try to resolve the paradox by just staying on the transcendent side of things. I tried that for a really long time. It doesn't work. Um, Essentially, we need to come into our senses, into our bodies, into our feelings. And until we do that, even the consciousness realization never stabilizes. And it doesn't stabilize because we're still because consciousness and our lives are not two separate things. They just appear that way. And because they're not two separate things, we reject any part and we're rejecting the whole thing. So even consciousness can't fully be realized until we start really so deeply embracing the whole truth of what is, that we're not rejecting fundamentally even the discomfort of just existing. And that's what drops us into a fundamental whole being realization. It's it's what happens when we stop trying to hold it all together, all these parts together, and we realize that it was all one thing from the beginning. Not only was everything all never separate parts, but I was never separate from any of them either. There's no fundamental separation anywhere. This is what happens during the embracing stage. And this sets us up for a deep healing of all of those control patterns that we were conditioned into as children. And so as we enter that period of transformation and shakedown of those old patterns, we find ourselves more and more deeply cherishing our experience as it is, really wanting to fully experience it. So we're loving ourselves as and life more and more gratitude, not as a mental idea or a philosophy or just a practice, just experiencing more gratitude because we're experiencing
More freedom,
more freedom, right? More wellness.
less of the patterns disabling us or interfering or grabbing for our attention in the ways that they used to. They're freeing up more.
It's almost like we've been dragging an old ox cart that had a lot of weight in it. And then as we come toward this stage, we feel a lot of that weight is coming off, and we become strong enough that we are allowed, that we can feel like we can deal with all of these weights one at a time. It's like, okay, what's in this ox cart here? What is this stuff? And we just start coming more and more deeply into the parts of ourselves that we've been afraid to encounter, that have been wired for our protection, but that wiring also keeps us out of ourselves. So now we're coming into ourselves in this cherishing phase. We integrate shadow aspects and we dismantle these control mechanisms, not necessarily through a lot of effort, although some people experience that there's intention needed for some parts of these. Other parts of this is quite spontaneous. It's almost like a natural purification. The more we are aligned with ourself, the less the unaligned conditioned parts just start dissolving in the presence of our alignment.
And the more aligned we get with nature, with life, the more free we become, the more freedom we experience.
And the more we trust our natural wisdom and we let go of our self-censorship. And self-censorship is a big thing.
It's huge.
Huge, especially in spiritual circles. You know, there's a lot of things that are not considered spiritual in spiritual circles. And so if we want to fit in, you know, there is some, you know, probably good not to show up with anger or frustration or neediness or, you know, some of these things that,
or fear,
or even an
fear.
ego, like leave your ego at the door. So, you know, obviously that's not our disposition at all. Obviously, that's not even the basic philosophical disposition in Trillium.
And for, I think most of us, we're not able to really come more into our own embodiment until we start to speak, until we stop censoring ourselves, until we speak what's really going on for us. And then we feel more of our own power and like we belong in the world. And life receives us in this way, in a beautiful way. We feel ourselves filling more with all of ourselves.
So when we're kids and we experienced that some parts of ourselves were not welcome, and we started shutting down around those parts, we noticed that we can't even, it's like there are things we can't say that are not going to be things that are not going to be well received, but therefore there's things we can't even feel. Because if we feel them, we'll naturally want to say what we're feeling. So we shut down our feeling as well to protect us from speaking our truth. And so as you're going through this shakedown and, you know, learning to cherish the truth of who you are, the speaking starts coming back. You start saying what you need to say, and you have to learn how to be skillful with it. And we help our clients learn how to do that. It's really important to learn how to do that. Anyway, one way or the other, we start embodying our uniqueness while being respectful of our impact on others. And toward the end of this stage 6 of cherishing, the universe is giving us a lot of challenges to our conditioned control mechanisms. So the universe is basically going to say, you know, this mechanism over here, I'm going to kind of shake that one up a little bit. How are you going to be with that?
Right. And then, you know, we think we're so awake, and then more keeps coming up. Like, oh my God, I thought I worked through this one.
How about this one?
Yeah, how about this? You gonna feel this now? No? Okay, well, I'll come back. I'll come back so you can feel it through.
Right. So, you know,
it's
anyway,
very, very humbling.
It's very humbling. And as we get humbled, our desire to control our experience gets worn away, because we can directly see that all of that is against ourselves. It's going in the wrong direction. It hurts us directly to try and control what's going on, because we can't, A, and B, it's too late. Whatever happened already happened.
And then we start falling more and more in love with who we are, actually.
Yeah. So as we let go of the control, we find ourselves going beyond surrender. Surrender, the word surrender, it's another whole great topic for a talk, just surrender. It's because we all have so much stuff around that word. But the surrender implies that there is a person here surrendering to something, you know, bigger authority or something like that, which is true. That's how we view it until we get to this stage where we're done with holding any separation on any level. And we're done with trying to control anything that's not ours to control. Cherishing just means we're really enjoying and appreciating being here. Wanting, really.
No matter what's going on.
Yeah, choosing to be here, whatever's going on.
And it doesn't mean it doesn't put you up against your stuff. I mean, I've dealt with illness for half of my lifetime. So pain on all kinds of levels, a lot of anxiety. Um, it just means there's no resistance to it anymore. So it doesn't necessarily look very enlightened.
Right.
But you're
That's
you're
right.
just in it. You're feeling it. You're being with it. You're letting it impact you in whatever way it wants to, but you're also not hooking on, you know? You're not um, hooking on to it. So it doesn't become a mental thing.
And then we're just living in what we call flow. And that's stage 7, flow or flowing.
And flow doesn't mean we don't experience pain or stuckness or confusion or not knowing. It's just, we just are feeling it. We just are it.
The body and emotions, having surrendered to the body and emotions, it means that we're living our lives almost like an awake animal, right? We're not trying to pretend we don't feel stuff anymore. We're not trying to pretend we're not afraid. Um, we're not trying to pretend that we don't care about people and things we care about, including ourselves. We just live life with, in a very vulnerable way. Fundamental doesn't mean we're being vulnerable with everybody, but we're choosing to be with the people who are right for us to be with.
Because you get your cues from your own body, you get your own instructions, and they are what guides you.
Yeah.
So you can feel really caring in a moment, and in another, not. You're not guided by rules in that way.
Right. Where the mind is not
Controlling
controlling
the show.
anymore.
Yeah.